Explore the history, relationships, expertise, and data that go into ensuring Stine growers get maximum yield potential. This is the Stine Seedcast. Here's your host, David Thompson.
Hello, and welcome to the Stine Seedcast. I'm your host, Stine's National Marketing and Sales Director, David Thompson. We've got another great episode lined up with special guests, expert Stine insights, and discussion on everything you need to know about the products in the company that maximizes yield potential. Today's episode, we're meeting with Warren Stine. Warren is the Assistant Director of Corn Research for Stine Seed Company. So his primary focus is on breeding and development of our proprietary corn inbreds and hybrids. He also helps manage our retail corn portfolio. So today, Warren is going to talk to us about the history of our corn breeding program, from the origins of the program, what we do in terms of breeding and development work, and what makes Stine's corn breeding program unique. Welcome to the show, Warren.
Thank you, David.
So to get us started, I guess give us a little bit of background about your history and your history with the company.
Well, I've been here for a long time. Our corn program started in 1978, and in 1978, that summer, I would have been 9 years old. And, I don't remember a whole lot about the inception of this. I've had to ask, my father questions about that. As I grew up, I got to know people, become more familiar with people in the corn program. I would say I grew up with this program, and I grew up getting to know people in there and absorbed by osmosis most of what I know. It wasn't necessarily like I was an integral part of this program ever until I got out of college. Much later.
Sure. But, you worked on the farm growing up, and refresh my memory. Prior to the corn program, did you work on the soybean side?
All of us actually started working kind of on the soybean side, doing a thing we call dumping beans.
Yep.
Now, the soybean program, originally when it was initiated, every single yield trial plot was harvested, and the seed from that individual plot was kept in a bag of some description. And when we were kids, our job was to sit in a small wooden grain wagon and dump these bags out, because we reused these bags every year.
And these would be those small, like 3 or 4 pound seed bags that
Yes. Well, and there were 2 different tests at the time. And so one set of tests went into a large paper envelope, which had 2 paper clips at the top. So we had to save the paper clips too, along with the envelope. And the other test was into it was a cloth bag with a wire tag wrapped around the top of it. And we got, so those bags were put into a large flour sack, is what it was. And you would have 100 paper envelopes in one bag, these flour bag, and 100 cloth ones in each, one of those flour bags. And you'd get 55 cents for dumping all 100 bags out of the paper kind, and you got 35 cents for dumping everything out of the cloth one. And so we'd sit in this wagon all day long in the back of a warehouse, just dumping these bags.
And to give a frame of reference, we're talking about thousands and thousands.
Yes,
and
the
thousands
warehouse.
Of bags.
You'd look out of the wagon across the warehouse, and it was just solid bags of these across the floor.
So in those days, then, were you thinking, okay, maybe the corn program is a better use of my time and talent, even as a youngster?
Didn't know anything about the corn program at that time. This, I think I might have actually started doing that when I was 6.
Okay.
And so it wasn't an hourly pay. You got paid by the bag. That's
Sure.
My parents thought that was a smarter thing. But all 4 of us kids, Lucinda, Brenda, and Myron would sit in that wagon and do that.
Okay.
So when the corn program started going, so that was, like I think I said earlier, that was about 77, 78. I didn't have any engagement really with it until I was probably about 12. And that's when I started doing hand pollinating. And that summer, my parents presented me with the idea that, well, you can either cross soybeans or you can pollinate corn. And you should try both and then decide which one you liked. And so I went and tried soybean crossing, which, soybean flowers are just minuscule, very teeny tiny, and you have to use a pair of tweezers to tear the flower apart. You get the male parts off the flower you want to use as a female, and then you have to take the male parts from another flower and apply them to that at an individual node on that soybean. It's so easy to knock these flowers off. I kept doing that over and over. You'd strip all the sepals, all the petals off this thing and get it just about to the point where you're prepared to do your cross on it. Then, boop, you'd knock it off the off the node. So I did that for basically a day and decided I had no aptitude, I had no skill. I was not going to go that route. So I literally walked across the lane at the back of the office to the corn nursery. And there was a lady there at the time named Donna Williams who thought, okay, we'll give you a try. And this could be good because I was tall when I was 12. And we had a lot of tall material at that point in time. And that just seemed like a good fit. So she showed me that. It was much simpler. All you have to do is put a bag up on the tassel and you later on put a bag down on the silks. That's a pretty easy process. You don't worry about knocking the whole ear off or necessarily the tassel off the plant. Pretty straightforward. So I stuck with that.
So never look back.
Never look back. Yeah, that's right. Not going to go try that soybean thing again.
So, I think one of the things when I talk to farmers that I think they're fascinated by is just the fact that Stine's corn program dates back into the 1970s. I think it's maybe a guarded secret that they weren't really aware of how long the company had been working on those things. And I know, you're a great student in history, so I wonder if you kind of give us an idea about the origins of that. I mean, is it something that was always in your father's mind from the beginning that, corn was something they want? And I know he was working with other crops. Anyway, just give me an idea of the how that came about.
Well, I think the story goes that as Dad had worked with soybeans, people were telling him the next thing you need to do is work with corn. And one of the people he was having conversations with was, I believe it was Noel Callahan, and there was a company called Callahan Seed, which was a pretty significant player in the industry back in the 70s. And Noel, I think, even recommended some publicly available corn inbreds that my dad should be working with. And at any rate, Dad put these, accessed all these things through the different universities at the time, set up some, what we call an isolation block, which is a small field where you have a common pollinator, but you have different females spread out across the isolation block. And I believe that was in 77 when he chose to do that. And there may have been 3 or 4 different isolation blocks. And an interesting, very trivial little bit of history is he had back surgery must have been the spring of 77. I don't know if he'd slipped a disc. He'd done something.
Okay.
And so he was still recovering from that. And then all of a sudden found out that he had to do a bunch of detasseling. And I think he was pretty miserable. I don't think he realized it was going to be quite that trying when he got started with that. But at any rate, the material from that, I believe, was either the following year self-pollinated there at Adel, or it was sent to Hawaii and pollinated there and then brought back. You get an extra generation moving things along that way. At some point early on in there, I know my mom actually went to Hawaii to actually do some of that pollinating one winter. And it may have been about the same time we picked up Donna Williams, and I don't know if that was 1981 or 1982. And I did make a little note here. Our first yield trial was in 1981, when we had our first early generation hybrids ready to test. And we had 6,000 of those that year, spread out across 4 locations, which were all in Iowa and all actually pretty close to Adel.
Sure.
An interesting thing when you talk about corn genetics and germplasm, and we look back in our program, most of that early material has not survived. It's actually almost all went into the trash pile. I would say by about 1993, 94, most of it was gone. There were very few things left from those first few years. At any rate, sometime after that first yield trial, I think we actually picked up another gentleman for our corn department, a guy by the name of James Mace. And Jim and Donna have both passed away within the last couple of years, which is too bad. You can't talk to him and ask questions that I should have asked. But Donna kind of ended up managing our corn nursery, and Jim would take care of harvesting yield trials and detasseling in our isolation blocks that we had set up. But we kept expanding the program from that point. This is another interesting little bit of trivia. If you go to the Adel office, there is an old, really run-down, crappy green metal sheeted building there. Oh. And there was one room on the west side of that building, which I don't know if it was maybe 30 feet by 25 feet, but all of our corn and soybean people worked in that one room together until the mid-'90s when we built our next office building. And then we started segregating them. They didn't get along. You couldn't have them in the same room anymore. But they would sit in there all winter and hand shell corn or clean soybeans up for packaged stuff. The entire program out of that one little teeny room, which just kind of blows my mind when you think about that. Let's see, what else can I say about that? I think we only had one planter at that time too for both research programs, and then when we got 2 planters, well, that was a big deal. And then we had to have 2 vans because you had to load them up with seed to take to their different locations. But both of those planters were actually run by the soybean department pretty much, because it was growing a lot faster than the corn department ever.
Well, and it would seem to me, that, obviously the basic building blocks of a breeding program are similar. However, the crops themselves are more different from a breeding standpoint than one might assume. So were there growing pains or kind of aha moments like, oh, okay, this is different? Because obviously the soybean program is really well established by that point. I guess I'm just curious what those earliest years were kind of like.
That's a really good question. I like to point out to people that soybeans, quite honestly, I think is easy. It is a self-pollinated crop. And as long as, in a plot situation, you haven't got seed spread from one plot to another, that individual plot, when you harvest it, that's good to go for next generation. That's what we used to do. Corn does not work like that at all. It's a naturally wind-pollinated crop, and it's very, very easy to get contamination into things. And that you have to be more focused. It takes more labor to get things done correctly. There's all kinds of trouble that you can get into with corn. I don't believe we ever had a set of circumstances where there was like a big disaster, but you would lose individual items here and there because of contamination from time to time.
Sure.
Or at least have things where you'd be set back a generation. But we never had it was like, oh my gosh, this is a disaster. We had a really good set of pretty dedicated people that did everything they could to make sure we wouldn't have that kind of a scenario unfold. Yeah, it gets really stressful during pollinating when you've got people to watch and you've got to worry about that exact kind of thing.
So you just touched on, the fact that, once you get done with a soybean cross, you have basically a new variety, right? And as long as you don't do anything to kind of mess that up, it's every time you plant that, you're kind of getting similar result. Corn, like you said, there's a lot of steps involved. So real briefly, can you kind of go through, the steps in the process? Because one of the things that makes our organization special is the fact that we are one of a handful of companies that does our own breeding work. And to do that, there are, the various steps in that process. Could you review that real quick?
On corn or soybeans?
Corn.
Or just
corn.
Yeah. So corn, a hybrid that has been commercialized that people are buying has two parents. And both parents have to go through a development and testing process. To get a parent finished for commercialization usually is about 8 generations, where you're self-pollinating every single generation. And up to that point, you've got things segregating every single generation. So in our case, what we do is we'll make an initial cross between 2 really good parents, and seed that gets crossed. If we make the cross in Iowa, we'll send it right now to Guyana in South America. We're the only company working down there. It will stay down there for 4 more generations of self-pollinating. The last generation, there'll be some seed that goes into an iso block, and another pile of seed will actually get sent back to Iowa to be self-pollinated some more the following summer. The seed that goes into that isolation block down there will get used to make a hybrid. It'll be used as a female in a test cross.
Okay.
And so once that cross is made, you test that in Iowa and have your next generation of material getting selfed again in Iowa. If it survives the test, you keep the rows that you selfed here in Iowa. If it doesn't, it goes into the trash. Most of the time, most of what we're working on in our nursery is, goes in, it's garbage. About 95% of your early generation stuff goes into the trash. But you still have to self-pollinate it and keep pushing it along until you get test results that say that you can make that decision to do that. So as an example, this last year we evaluated 50,000 hybrids of first generation testing. There's only going to be just a few percent of that you're actually going to keep. So most of that went into the trash. The items you keep go into, they'll get selfed again. You'll make new hybrids. You'll have items segregating out of that, we would call it a line that you've kept. So we'll get what we call sub-selections or selections. Get 4 or 5 of those to segregate out of that line, and you have to make hybrids with each one of those selections. Every one of those hybrids gets tested in the next year's test seed. Sometimes we can make it in Adel, but generally that test seed is getting made in either Argentina, Chile, or Guyana during the winter. So that comes back, goes into that trial, and you'll try to pick out the best one of those selections to move ahead with the following year. And if you've got something that looks really, really good, something really red hot, not only will you additionally self that one more time, but you'll actually look at potentially bulking that up, having multiple rows of that selection that you kept, assuming it's uniform enough so you can get seed together and maybe put out pilot seed, something that could go into a strip trial that next year.
So that's literally just getting seed enough to do, like you said, testing or foundation for parent seed.
Yeah, parent seed foundation. Yeah.
Over the course of time, the last, what has it been, 50 years now, what are some of the things that have changed about how corn breeding happens?
Well, that's a really good question. For us, surprisingly enough, not that much. We're using some markers. Markers are very commonly used by just about everybody in the industry. But there are some tools out there that have become very popular with other seed companies that we're not utilizing. We don't have a dihaploid program. Most people are using a dihaploid program, which for people that don't know what that is, when you're making your brand new population for inbred parents, you apply a kind of a critter that allows you to go in one generation to supposedly 100% pure on a new inbred.
Okay.
It's not quite that simple, but for the sake of conversation today, we don't use dihaploids because we like the idea of getting things to segregate out every single generation in the development process instead of going to that 100% pure right away. So we don't do that. And then a lot of people are using sort of predictive analysis to try to tell them ahead of time which inbreds they need to be moving ahead. What's the hybrid going to look like? Try to make a model, a mathematical model to tell them if we put inbred A and inbred B together, the hybrid is going to look like this. And we're not quite into that. And that uses markers, once again, to support that. But we don't do anything like that either. We'll use markers to give us an idea of maybe family backgrounds, give you some idea of maybe these things might have more disease resistance than this material over there. But some general stuff and not quite the specific things that other people are using. Now, soybean department uses more markers than we do on corn department.
So it sounds like whether it's, dihaploids or some of these predictive analysis, really it's about, well, it depends on your point of view, I guess. One would say trying to use this as a predictive tool to find efficiency. The flip side of that is a shortcut of sorts, right? Can we shortcut the system so it doesn't take as many generations to do what we need to do? Right?
That's right. And we're of the opinion right now that is just not the best direction to go. We don't think that works quite so well. We follow what I would describe as a very naturalistic approach to breeding. I don't know if you want to call it Darwinian, sort of survival of the fittest. We have a program that we let Mother Nature kind of sort through things, let her do her thing, try to capitalize on that. Not so much using some of these tools. And at the end of the day, when you start looking at the resources people are putting into developing these tools, how expensive they are, the level of efficiency, we think rather than building models of stuff, why don't you just yield test it? By the time you've got enough data points put together to make some characterizations of how these things are going to work when they interact, you're at the point where you might as well run a yield trial anyway in terms of timeline. So we just don't see the advantage.
Talk a little about the size and scope of the program, because I know, I think one of the things we've always been adamant about is, size of the test is important, right, for finding the very best material. So over time, what's been the growth of the corn breeding program?
Oh, boy. Well, I think I just mentioned earlier that this last year we evaluated 50,000 hybrids first time. And that's the entry-level tier. And the next tier after that, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 hybrids this year. The difference between those two tests, the two tiers, is that the first level tier, we only have either 10 reps or 10 locations. That next tier up, we triple that. We want 30 plus reps or 30 plus locations. Get that hybrid out in a lot of different environments across the Midwest and see how it behaves in those environments to kind of sort through those things. But in terms of volume, 50,000 hybrids is that's pretty significant.
Sure, yeah.
That's huge. I used to think maybe back in the 90s that when we were testing, 7,000 or 8,000 hybrids first generation, that was a big deal. And that's nothing. That's nothing now.
So I know that as we look back across corn genetics, one of the things I always find fascinating is, in our program, I think you can really do a lot of tracing back of the material. And I think among corn breeders in general, there's this ability to almost trace that family tree all the way back. Could you talk a little bit about, that ability to get back to be able to trace the roots of that genetics all the way back?
Well, yeah, this is pretty interesting and kind of fun for me to talk about this. All of our hybrid genetics today originated with open pollinated corn that people had, well over 100 years ago here in the United States. And there were many, many different open pollinated varieties, quite literally hundreds of those. And some of the key open pollinated varieties, hybrid corn started coming on the scene. People would go use those as sources for genetics. We make inbreds. You have to have inbreds in hybrid corn development. Open pollinated varieties, there were no inbreds pretty much.
Right.
But people had to use those as sources, those open pollinated varieties as sources to make their inbreds. And so there are a number of families that have sort of popped up out of these open pollinated varieties that we like to refer to a lot on the corn breeding side today. So what I'm kind of talking about here is a lot of good female genetics in the United States, and it's regardless of seed company that you're working with. A lot of good female genetics are derived from a thing out of Iowa State called B73. So this was a inbred that was actually selected for corn borer tolerance, almost went into their scrap pile. They kind of saved it sort of by accident. But the parents of that thing are traced back to an open pollinated variety known as reed yellow dent, which was very, very popular in the early 1900s and was probably the number one open pollinated variety of corn in the United States in the early 1900s. So B73, you can sort of trace it back to that origin. If we switch gears and talk about male genetics that a lot of people in the industry are familiar with, one of the things that a lot of older folks would know was an inbred called Missouri 17. So it was University of Missouri. This thing, I believe, is traced back to an open pollinated variety called Lancaster Surecrop, which came out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a guy named Isaac Hershey. There are other families. Those are two of the main ones. But interestingly enough, when you take B73 and you cross it to Missouri 17, you get a pretty fantastic hybrid that was very popular here in the Midwest back in the early 1970s, late 1960s, I think. So heterotic groups are basically families that you try to breed within those families to make new inbreds, but you cross between the families to make hybrids.
So the idea is that the hybrid vigor or heterosis results from the crossing of these two
correct
different genetic pools.
Yes, correct. Yeah. And I hadn't really thought about, never occurred to me we'd be talking about that today.
Well, to me, that's always fascinating because it's kind of the idea of the family tree, right? I mean, when you talk to corn breeders, it's amazing that you can go back, to some hybrid we have today. And I think based on your story here, you can go back and say, well, this all, at least is due in part to some guy in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Like Isaac Hershey.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
It's just to be able to trace it back with that kind of, and obviously they change over time, but I think that's still very fascinating. So you talked about, inbred development, and there's basically, would you say there's kind of four basic, kind of quadrants when we talk about heterotic families?
Yeah, generally, yeah, that's what the way we kind of look at it. So out of this B73 group, which is properly known as the stiff stalk synthetic group, there's also a subgroup known as B14, which is almost identical but earlier, works well north, doesn't have good disease tolerance to move south. But B14s, if you look at a lot of seed companies' early genetics, there's usually a B14 somewhere in that background. There's another interesting group called the iodents, and iodents are getting to be very, very popular. The background on these is a little unusual, but they tend to have high test weight. In your breeding program, you can get away with sometimes using them as males and females. And for whatever reason, the iodent family is carrying along quite a bit of yield punch with it. High test weight stuff, just a really, really impressive family. Going back to the Lancaster short crop open pollinator variety that gave us our Missouri 17s, there's a subfamily out of that that's called the Ohio 43 family. And it's interesting with these names. Ohio 43, it's exactly like you would think it came out of Ohio. Missouri 17, it was developed in Missouri. But B73, the B letter actually stands for Iowa, because I believe that was developed as part of a USDA testing program, and they had different names for their experimental stations, and for whatever reason, the state of Iowa's experimental stations got stuck with the letter B. So
that's where it came from. Huh?
Yes. Yeah.
You brought up earlier about, certain genetics being, male or female.
Yeah.
And as a, someone who's not familiar with corn breeding work, I guess it's always been interesting to me, what constitutes that? Because obviously if an inbred can pollinate itself, it's male and female. So what makes one more predisposed than the other?
Well, if you go look at the female inbreds, as a rule of thumb, they tend to make a little smaller kernel. Uniformity from one kernel to the next is pretty high. If you move over to the male genetics and you look at those ears, you get big, fat kernels that ugly shapes. If we were all going to use male genetics as our seed source, your bag of seed would be like 65 pounds. They don't germinate very well, but males, of course, are fantastic at making pollen in your seed corn production field. Wonderful for that. Female genetics, on the other hand, not good producers of pollen as a rule of thumb. But those nice uniform kernels give you a high rate of germination. So basically, you can almost walk through anybody's nursery, and if you look at ears of stuff, you can kind of make determinations. And, I bet that's male genetics. I bet this is female-type genetics. Until you come to the iodent material, which in terms of ear size and the way the kernels look, they look very, very female, but very often they're pretty good pollinators at the same time.
But generally speaking, it boils down to, the seed set, what it looks like, what the ear consistency is, what it looks like versus what the tassel production is. And that
pollen production,
that pretty much puts it in one of two categories.
Yes.
So it's not that you can't use it the other way around. It's just you're probably not going to be happy with the product, or maybe less likely to be happy with the product.
That's right.
Okay.
And my impression is that the way the seed industry is, the way we're using things as males and females, have to remember those inbreds were pulled out of open pollinated sources, open pollinated corn. Well, those guys weren't thinking in terms of males and females. And so all of those open pollinated hybrids that people were using probably had really good vigor, seed vigor, really good germination. Seems like the way things went female and went male maybe came later, probably in the 1930s, as people were making selections then. I don't think it was it wasn't so natural. It was almost accidental that it went that way. It's like, this seems to work a little bit better as a female. I'll keep doing that. And as they kept breeding the same material, things that kind of worked a little better as female, it actually got to be better working as female. And same way with a male material.
If you talk to a farmer who wants to know about Stine corn, what do you want them to know about Stine corn?
Hold on. My brother is calling me right now, and I'm just going to
let's put him on the air. Hold him up to the microphone.
Want me to do that?
Do it. Why not?
Hey, I'm here with David, and we're recording a podcast.
Oh, I'm gonna let you go.
We were hoping to jazz things up with a little input here, but okay. All right.
I can jazz things up.
I'm sure you could, but we'll let you go. Talk to you later.
Okay. All right,
Okay, bye. Okay, now what was the question?
So when you talk to a farmer who wants to know about Stine and our corn program, what do you want them to know about Stine's corn program?
Well, Dad, telling people he's a farmer all the time, he treats our corn program a lot like, it's part of the farming operation, and
Sure.
he wouldn't put things on our farm that he wouldn't think that some other farmer wouldn't be able to plant, to utilize.
Yep.
And I don't think there are any other breeding programs out there that have a farmer that stands at the top of them and basically decides which hybrids you're going to move forward with, which ones are going into the trash. And I think that's kind of comforting in some ways. It's not, it's not such a clinical thing that you get in other breeding programs where, we've got a software program that's going through and picking out what hybrids we're going to bring to our customers. So there's a human touch there and an actual farmer mindset attached to what's coming out of our breeding program.
I think that's spot on. I think that's perfect. Well, thanks, Warren. Appreciate you being here today, talking about our corn breeding program. Always a pleasure to visit about that, and appreciate you being on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, David. This was fun.
Make sure to tune in 2 weeks from now as we kick off our annual Women in Ag campaign, where we talk to some of the women making their mark in the ag industry. To never miss an episode, subscribe to the Stine Seedcast wherever podcasts are found. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.
To learn more about Stine and its elite corn and soybean genetics, visit stineseed.com. Subscribe to the Stine Seedcast wherever podcasts are found. Stine has yield.